Conversion therapy and reparative therapy are not terms that I had ever heard of and certainly used while I went through my own 6 years of therapy. I was 24 years old when I met my former psychiatrist in 1989. My family, all staunch Catholics, had rejected me after I came out a couple of years earlier. And so I fled my hometown in Canada. I was devastated and lonely. In this sense, I think I was not unlike a lot of young LGBTQ people. Definitely a few generations ago, and I think probably still today. I was deeply depressed. I knew I was gay, but being gay seemed to cause my family and me so much suffering. I felt guilty and conflicted, at times suicidal. So I reached out to talk to somebody in the only way I knew how, through our medical system. And I asked for a referral to a psychiatrist because in Canada, psychiatry is covered under our healthcare, socialized healthcare. I just wanted to talk to somebody at the end of the day. Conversion therapy, I've come to learn through the years, is an umbrella term meant to include a whole spectrum of practices and therapies aimed at changing sexual orientation. Basically, a person tries to become what they're not. I don't think any of these treatments actually refer to themselves as conversion therapy. Mine definitely didn't. But they all begin with some version of the same lie that says to be gay or homosexual is an illness or a disease, a deviation or moral failing of some kind that should be cured, corrected, or healed. At the very least, we should love the sinner and hate the sin. For me, these kinds of lies started early in my life as a child when I was sexually abused. And then I grew up being taught at school and from my religion and the media and my own family that sexual abuse makes a person homosexual. I was definitely homosexual. This much seemed clear to me right from puberty. But the idea that I had become who I was because of sexual abuse haunted me through most of my young adolescence. This lie that abuse of any kind causes a person to be gay is alive and well even today in 2017. I read articles all the time about how some people still believe gays recruit, or that people end up gay because of some sort of childhood abuse or faulty parenting, even when there's a gentle but pervasive conflation between homosexuality and pedophilia. It makes me very sad. Because I know for myself, through life experience, believing these kinds of lies led me down a very dark and lonely path, practically toward my own self-destruction. As I mentioned, I stayed in this therapy for and I use quotes around that term every time I say the word therapy, for 6 years, throughout which the main driving force or lie, which of course at the time seemed to me to be the truth, was that if sexual abuse had made me gay, then healing from the abuse would logically mean that I'd revert to my underlying heterosexuality, or so my doctor reinforced. Like peeling an onion, a metaphor he also liked to use often, if I kept at this unraveling process, beneath all the layers of abuse, I'd arrive back at my heterosexual core. To achieve this desired outcome, my doctor's main methods of correction to my sexuality were primal regressive therapy, basically intense bouts of crying and screaming and hammering a baseball bat against a punching bag to release pent-up rages, combined with massive doses of various psychiatric medications. And yet, no matter how much therapy or medication I took, I could not reach this impossible goal of heterosexuality. Figuratively peeling myself down to a core year after year of excruciating primal regressive therapy never led me back to any kind of heterosexuality. All it did was grind me down toward nothing, like slow suicide. Even labels about who or what I was all turned meaningless as my life became less about being gay or straight and more about being myself or not myself, alive or shamed into death. But of course, long before the entire ordeal ended, it got a whole lot worse. Obviously and thankfully, I've come to learn that this idea of conversion therapy is a lie. But I've also learned that part of the lie is the words we use to describe this experience, the euphemisms of deflection. In reality, these methods to change sexuality are never therapy, and they're not therapeutic. Nothing, of course, is ever converted or repaired. These kinds of treatments aren't even really about changing sexual orientation. They're about eradicating homosexuality, silencing it, ending it once and for all in the bodies of people that are gay. They turn the desire to belong into a desire to change one's sexuality. The locus of attention no longer remains on the hatred or intolerance, the oppression, but on the person whose sexuality is now under attack. Killing turns out to be as easy as therapy. For the first 2 years after leaving treatment, I was plagued by acute anxiety and a heightened sense of depersonalization. Who I was did not match what I'd been doing to myself for 6 long years. It's not so much that I wanted to kill myself as I thought I was already dead. Slowly, I recovered, and then I spent many years writing this book, in large part to help prevent the recurrence of similar forms of torture, particularly for young people. I wrote my book because I think that in addition to creating laws banning these kinds of treatments from continuing, we need to also change hearts. And I think sometimes we can change hearts and then in effect help to change the world a little bit at a time by telling the truth of our lives, what we've been through and what we've learned. This is my first book, so I don't have many books to compare it to, and it's a book about trauma, and it's a book about being traumatized with a lot of psychiatric medication. So in terms of writing nonfiction, one of the huge difficulties I faced was getting the facts straight. And that's probably why it took like 20 years, including pitching it to everyone and everyone's uncle. But I knew enough to be able to string the linear story together, to piece my life back together. But it required just an awful lot of work and research I had journals, I had taped recordings of primal sessions, I had still friends that I could talk to, and just piecing all of this back together through trauma. And also, I changed faster than I could write. So I was healing, and in the process of healing, I was not the person that I was when I went through these traumas. And so I needed to take that into account. Forgiving people changed my perception of their acts. And so how I wrote fact was not always cut and dry. That was very difficult. That's been a really strong theme throughout this journey. For anyone who's experienced trauma, they'll know that what they need almost more than anything is to be believed. They need to be heard, they need to be believed. And very early in my recovery, I went back into a safe counseling, I was believed. But when it became clear to me that I needed to transmit this into a book for the world, that I needed to share my story so that maybe these things won't keep happening, I was disbelieved over and over and over and over. And for a trauma survivor, and I don't really like to attach labels like that, it makes me a bit uncomfortable, the trauma survivor label, but for lack of a better term, it's almost the worst thing to put yourself through. And it was just year in and year out of, first reporting the doctor to the college. I'm sure here you have something similar, a body that all physicians report to. We have the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So I reported him to the ethics committee. And that was a very long, drawn-out process, and it was just a process of not being believed. And then the lawsuit of not being believed. And then trying to get the book published, and the literary agents, this is too horrendous, this couldn't have happened. The publishers, is too egregious. Public won't believe this story. It's like, it just, you know, that was really hard. That was really hard, because the only thing I wanted to do was just say, you know, so it happened, I don't want it to happen again, but this is what happened. And they wouldn't, and people just couldn't believe it, because it's like, these things don't happen. Yet they do. They do. I mean, actually, even in light of the recent, you know, explosion of assault cases and all of these things, I mean, these things are happening. You know, they're happening. So people need to talk up. But that's really hard for somebody who's experienced these types of traumas to not be believed. Intimacy for the first couple of years was the most acute period for me. There's things in the book that I won't mention because I don't want to ruin the book for people who might still want to read it, but there were flashbacks to certain things that was very like physiological, not even just memories, just like sensory flashbacks, and very upsetting, very disturbing. But you know, I will say generally that, you know, I've worked really hard. I mean, writing the book, but also therapy, proper, good, healthy therapy. And I've had intimate relationships with men, I've loved men, I've had sex with men, free from shame, you know. So, you know, I could say by and large I've recovered, if one can ever recover. I mean, life is an ongoing process, right? We're all navigating that, but yes, absolutely. But it's not something that I think that just happens in isolation and by standing still. You know, recovery is work. It's work. And writing was also my form of work. Writing can be enormously healing.